Don't touch him. Sadie Nowak had no idea who the four men in dark suits were, or why they had walked into the accounts payable office of Leclair Holdings at 2:15 on a Wednesday. She did know that the enormous black dog pressed against her legs under the desk was trembling, and that these men were the reason why. The animal had appeared in her doorway 23 minutes earlier, not running, not distressed, just walking with the deliberate calm of something that had somewhere to be. It had looked at the room, looked at her, and come to sit beside her chair as though they had an appointment. The men arrived at minute 24. 4 of them, which seemed like a significant deployment for an office that contained a spreadsheet and a broken espresso machine in the break room down the hall. The one in front stepped toward the dog without knocking, without a word, without anything Sadie could charitably describe as a greeting. "Don't touch him." The words came out before she'd finished deciding to say them. The man paused. He looked at her the way people look at something mildly inconvenient they intend to move around shortly. "That's not your animal." "I know that." Sadie kept her hand near the dog's shoulder. The trembling was fine and involuntary, not the trembling of terror, but the kind that comes from a body that has been running on high alert for too long and cannot remember how to stop. But he's not going anywhere right now. "Ma'am. What's his name?" A pause. The man calculated something. Answering was apparently faster. "Knox." Sadie looked down. The dog, Knox, looked up at her. His eyes were dark brown and very serious, conveying something specific she was still working out. She scratched behind his ear, slowly, his trembling eased by half. "He needs a minute," she said. "Whatever happened out there, he needs a minute when nobody expects anything from him." "That's not." "I understand." The fifth voice came from the doorway. The 4 men stepped aside, with the kind of immediate, wordless coordination that told Sadie everything before she looked up. When she looked up, she understood the rest. Hugo Leclair was the sort of man who made a room recalibrate the moment he entered it. He owned the building she was sitting in. He owned the restaurants whose accounts she reconciled each quarter, the real estate attached to them, the supply chain feeding, and, according to a thorough piece in the Globe and Mail that Sadie had read when she'd first taken this contract, a substantial portion of Toronto's East End that no journalist could specify precisely without their legal team going quiet. He was 41 years old and possessed the particular stillness of someone who had not been surprised in a very long time. He was also, apparently, the owner of the dog sitting on her foot. "Accounts," he said, not a question. He had placed her. "Sadie Nowak, contract accounts manager, 3rd floor. Knox doesn't come to 3rd floors." He said it without accusation, just noting an anomaly in a system he understood completely. He seemed motivated. She glanced down at Knox, whose full weight had now settled against her leg, with the boneless certainty of something that had made a decision. "Could you ask your men to wait outside?" The silence had a texture to it. She had no way of reading which direction it would go. Then Hugo made the smallest possible gesture with 2 fingers, and all 4 men disappeared without a sound. He stayed. He looked at his dog. He looked at her. "He's not disobeying you," Sadie said, because the expression on Hugo Leclair's face was one she recognized. She'd seen it on people who brought animals in confused and frightened, searching for something broken when there was nothing broken at all. He's full, too much input for too long, too many people expecting things from him. He needs somewhere quiet where the pressure just stops for a minute. Hugo's jaw tightened slightly. "He has the finest trainers in the country. I believe you. He has never behaved this way before. That doesn't mean today can't be different from every other day." She scratched Knox's ear again. The dog exhaled, one long, slow breath, and the last of the trembling left him. "Give him a few minutes. He'll go when he's ready." Hugo said nothing. He looked at Knox, at her, back at Knox. Then he moved to the window and stood there with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking at the street below, and he waited. 7 minutes later, Knox stood. He looked at Sadie with the considered gravity of an animal who has made his assessments and wishes them noted. Then he walked across the office to Hugo and pressed his head against the man's hand. Hugo's palm settled along the side of Knox's skull without any of the commanding weight she'd expected. It was careful, almost gentle. Something in his face that she hadn't expected to see on a man who owned half the East End. Something that looked, briefly, like relief. "How did you know?" he said, not looking up. "I pay attention." She turned back to her screen. "He's fine. You can go." She assumed that was the end of it. She was wrong. Hugo Leclair returned the following Tuesday. Knox walked directly to Sadie's desk and positioned himself beside her chair with the satisfaction of someone completing a commute. Hugo stood in the doorway with the expression of a man who had arrived at a scheduled appointment and is only just realizing no appointment exists. "He wouldn't eat this morning," Hugo said. Sadie looked at Knox. Knox looked back at her. He was visibly fine. Bright eyes, relaxed ears, already calculating the distance to the treat tin she kept on the corner of the desk. She opened the tin. Knox ate 3 treats in the time it took Hugo to finish his sentence about nutritional consistency. She looked at Hugo. He looked at Knox. Knox looked at the tin. "Your dog," Sadie said, "is negotiating." Knox doesn't negotiate. He's remarkably good at it. Hugo left that day without any of the certainty he'd arrived with. He returned Thursday. Knox had been restless at the house. He came back the following Monday because Knox had started pulling toward the building during their morning walks. He came back the Monday after that because Knox seemed... Hugo delivered this one with visible reluctance, distracted. Sadie stopped being surprised. She left an extra water bowl under the 3rd floor conference table. Knox took his visits seriously. He made a full inspection of the office each time. Checked behind the filing cabinets. Examined the baseboards with professional interest. Had a brief and inconclusive encounter with the photocopier. And then folded himself under Sadie's desk with the contentment of something arriving home. He stole a granola bar from her bag once, took it to the corner, and ate it without making eye contact with anyone. Hugo stood near the window and found her accounts receivable workflow very interesting, apparently. "He doesn't actually need to keep coming here," Sadie said one afternoon, not looking up. "He disagrees. He's a dog. He likes routine." She glanced at Knox, who had located a foam stress ball and was redesigning it thoughtfully. "How many hours a day is he on alert? Watching you, watching the room, waiting for something to happen." Hugo frowned. "He's trained for it." "I didn't ask what he was trained for. I asked when he gets to stop." She set down her pen. "When does he chase something pointless? When does he sit somewhere boring and not have to care what happens next?" Hugo looked at her as though she'd proposed something genuinely foreign. "He's a protection dog." "He's also a dog." She nodded toward Knox, who had fallen asleep on his side, legs extended at an optimistic angle, one ear folded inside out against the carpet. Hugo stared at him for a long moment. "His reputation," Sadie said, "may not survive this floor." Knox snored. Hugo looked at the dog, then quietly, to himself more than to her, "He's never slept like that at home." Sadie filed that away and said nothing. Things shifted the afternoon Nathan Bray arrived for the quarterly audit. Nathan was 29, reliably cheerful, and had been reviewing Leclair Holdings restaurant accounts for 3 years. He brought Sadie a coffee from the Tim Hortons on King Street every visit, large. 2 milks, no sugar, because he had remembered without being asked, and never made a point of it. Knox greeted him. The way Knox greeted very few people. Immediate, enthusiastic, pushing his enormous head into Nathan's hands while Nathan laughed and scratched his ears with genuine delight. Hugo, who had arrived 20 minutes earlier, for no specified reason, watched all of this from the far side of the room. "Friendly guy," Nathan said. "He is selective," Hugo said. Sadie kept her eyes on her screen. After Nathan left, Hugo remained. Knox went back to sleep. Sadie lasted about 30 seconds. "You can ask," she said. "Ask what?" "Whatever you haven't been asking for the last 40 minutes. Hugo adjusted one cuff with the precision of a man doing something careful with his hands, so his face doesn't have to do anything. "How long have you known Bray?" 3 years. "He brings you coffee." "He brings me coffee." She looked at him. His expression was perfectly neutral, which she had learned meant something was happening beneath it. "Nathan is a professional acquaintance. He knows how you take it. So does the woman at the counter on King." Hugo said nothing. Knox stirred, looked at both of them with the mild assessment of a third party, electing not to get involved, and went back to sleep. 2 days later, Hugo arrived carrying lunch. Not personally. Technically, one of his associates carried it. 2 bags from a restaurant in the distillery district, with a waiting list measured in months. The bags occupied a significant portion of her desk. "This is too much food," Sadie said. "You skip lunch when you're focused. You've been here 5 times. I observe quickly." He sat across from her and opened the nearest container without asking, with the calm of a man accustomed to sitting wherever he chooses. Sadie looked at Knox. Knox looked at Hugo with the patient attention of an animal who has arrived at conclusions he's too dignified to announce. She opened her own container. "This isn't about Nathan," she said. "Correct." "Hugo." He looked up. She waited. He looked back at his food. Knox put his chin on Hugo's knee, which was new. Hugo rested one hand on top of Knox's head without appearing to notice he'd done it. Sadie watched that and said nothing at all. The Leclair Holdings annual stakeholders' dinner was held in a private room on the 42nd floor downtown, and Sadie hadn't planned to attend until her name appeared on the invitation under supporting contractors and professional partners. She went because the invitation recognized the work, and she had done the work. Hugo was already there. He looked like he had been assembled for rooms like this one. Sadie was wearing the navy dress she'd bought for her cousin's wedding, and had been telling herself was perfectly fine. A woman named Adele Fontaine found her within 7 minutes. Adele was connected to 3 of Leclair Holdings' legitimate partners, and possessed the social ease of someone who had never once questioned whether a room was glad she was in it. She smiled at Sadie with entirely genuine warmth, that nonetheless managed to reduce her before she'd finished her sentence. "You're the bookkeeper," Adele said. "Hugo's accounting girl." "Sadie Nowak, contract accounts manager," she kept her voice pleasant. Of course, the correction was absorbed and evaporated simultaneously. It happened again across the room, and a third time at a table near the windows. "This is Sadie. She handles Hugo's numbers." Each introduction arrived with a smile and landed precisely, not malicious, just diminishing. By the 4th, 2 years of quarterly reconciliations and 3 regulatory discrepancies she'd caught and resolved before they became problems had compressed themselves into Hugo's accounting girl, delivered to a table of people who would now remember her that way. The moment came when Adele remarked, lightly, to a group of senior partners, that the real trick to landing good clients was simply being in the right building at the right time. A few polite laughs, the kind that don't feel like anything until you're outside afterward. Sadie put down her glass. "I came onto this contract because my firm held the lowest error rate in the city for restaurant group accounts 3 years running," she said. Her voice was completely calm. "Leclair's procurement team contacted us. I've flagged 14 reconciliation discrepancies in 32 months. 2 of them were reportable liabilities. She looked at Adele without heat. But yes, location matters too. Silence. Then Hugo's voice, from somewhere behind her left shoulder. Why was she invited this evening? He wasn't asking Sadie. He was looking at the managing director of the events committee, who straightened immediately. Monsieur Nowak's firm has provided contracted accounting oversight across our restaurant and hospitality division for 32 months, the director said. Her reviews have prevented 3 significant regulatory liabilities. Hugo looked at Adele. Not long, just long enough. Then introduce her accordingly. He hadn't raised his voice once. He hadn't needed to. When Sadie's name came up in the formal acknowledgements later that evening, it was her full name and her actual work. The accounts manager credited with the operational stability review across the portfolio. She found him near the windows afterward. You didn't have to do that, she said. Yes, I did. I handled Adele. I know you did. He turned to face her. I handled the record. That's different. She looked at him. He had waited. She understood that now. He had waited until she'd answered for herself, and only then stepped in for something else. Not her honor. Just the facts, stated plainly, in front of people who would carry them forward. You could have made it significantly worse for her, Sadie said. I considered it. She laughed before she could stop herself. But in the car home, looking out at the lake, she thought about what it meant that Hugo Leclair could correct one room. He could not correct every room. His world reorganized the meaning of everything it came near. A quiet accountant standing beside him became a character in his story. A professional relationship became a footnote in someone else's power structure. A woman who had spent 3 years building a reputation that was entirely hers could arrive somewhere as someone's accounting girl, and it would feel almost reasonable to everyone in that room. She liked Hugo. That was no longer the question. The question was what her name would be worth over time, standing beside someone whose gravity bent everything toward him. 2 weeks later, Knox was asleep under her desk, and Sadie said what she'd been working out since the dinner. He doesn't need to keep coming here. Hugo looked up. He's better, she said. He sleeps. He's off alert. He eats without negotiating. She nodded toward enormous and peaceful on the carpet. Whatever he needed from these visits, he has it. You don't need to bring him anymore. Hugo was quiet for a moment, understood. He called Knox. Knox stood with the resigned dignity of a large animal, accepting an unfair decision gracefully. He looked back at Sadie, a long, deliberate look, and followed Hugo to the door. He did not return the next day, or the day after. A week passed. The office was exactly as it had always been. Tidy, efficient, quiet. The water bowl was still under the conference table. The treat tin was still on the corner of the desk. The spot beside her chair was empty, and she was aware of it constantly, which was inconvenient. She missed Knox stealing her granola bars and eating them in the corner with elaborate innocence. She missed the warmth of him under the desk during the long afternoon hours. She missed the sound of Hugo's voice when he wasn't being careful with it, which was different from his public voice in ways she'd apparently been cataloguing without meaning to. Her work was still hers. Her office was still hers. Her name meant exactly what she'd built it to mean. Nothing had been taken from her. Something was missing. Across the city, Hugo was having a different problem. Knox was completely fine. He ate without incident, exercised, slept well. He was measurably calmer than he'd been in years. He did not need Sadie Nowak's third-floor accounting office in any way that could be professionally justified. The problem was that Hugo had been arriving at that office and staying long after Knox fell asleep. He had noticed, when she cut her hair in October, nothing dramatic, just shorter at the back. He had learned that she hummed when she was working through something and went very quiet when she'd solved it. He had become, without any reasonable plan to do so, irritated by a contract auditor who brought coffee in paper cups twice a quarter. None of that was Knox's doing. Knox had stopped being the reason weeks before Hugo had been able to say so. 3 weeks after his last visit, the elevator doors opened on the 3rd floor, and Hugo Leclair walked into Sadie's office without his dog. She looked up. She looked past him at the empty doorway. "Where's Knox?" "At home." She straightened. "Is something wrong?" "No." "He's eating normally?" "Yes." "Restless?" "No." She waited. Hugo Leclair stood in her tidy, quiet office with no dog and no leash and no manufactured concern and nothing at all to hide behind, and the silence between them had a different quality than any silence they'd had before, the kind with no exit built into it. "Then why are you here?" she said. A long pause. "I wanted to see you." He said it simply, without the controlled precision he used for everything else. Like a man who had spent considerable time looking for a more defensible version of the same sentence and was now delivering this one before he could complicate it again. "I spent 3 weeks trying to find a better reason. There isn't one." Sadie looked at him. The man who had corrected a room full of connected people without raising his voice. The man who had crouched on this very floor and waited quietly for a trembling dog to decide it was safe to move. The man who had apparently arrived, at 41, at the understanding that waiting was sometimes the only honest thing available. "So this isn't about Knox," she said. "No." "You're certain?" Because he could suddenly develop a serious problem with his food bowl. Hugo almost smiled. "Sadie." She let him wait just one more beat. "What do you want?" she said. He understood what she was doing. No dog between them. No professional cover. No exit available to either of them. He looked at her directly, and she watched him arrive. Finally, without deflection, without the careful management he applied to everything else, at the plainest version of himself. "I'd like to take you to dinner," he said. And then, because she waited, and because she had always waited for the honest version, "Sadie Nawak, would you have dinner with me?" She smiled, yes. Something in his shoulders settled, a tension she hadn't fully clocked until it was gone. She would understand later that Knox had simply known before either of them did. Not because of anything mystical, but because Knox had found a flaw where nobody expected anything from him, and he could just be bad at things. Steal granola bars, redesign stress balls, sleep with his legs at impractical angles, and he had gone back to it again and again, because it was the only place he'd found that felt like rest. Hugo had followed, each time with a different excuse. And somewhere between a trembling dog under a desk and a man walking through a door with nothing left to hide behind, both of them had found the same thing in the same place. Knox had known first. Hugo had simply needed longer to admit it wasn't the dog bringing him back.